Welcome to an episode of Behind the Scenes, a weekly program unveiling the biggest political developments in Somali politics. I'm Sultan Mohammed, your host and co-producer here on HORUFADHI Media, alongside Suleiman Hashi. On this week's program, President Hassan Sheikh returns from the UAE after a week stay in the Arab country. What were some of the topics agreed upon between the leaders? Furthermore, as Somalia reignites its relationship with the UAE, is Somalia being dragged further into the new Arab Cold War? Also on the program, how accurate are rumours circulating regarding the UAE facilitating secret talks or meetings between Somali and Israeli officials? Is it actually possible to see Somalia sign the Abraham Accords? These are the topics on the program today. We hope you find this program very informative. Please like, share, and for similar content, do subscribe to HORUFADHI Media. Also, do subscribe to HORUFADHI Media Group's second channel, known as HORUFADHI TV, where you can find exclusive programs such as the African Weekly Roundup and Mhahisala, among others. And last but not least, do follow myself, Sultan Mohammed, Suleiman Hashi, Yasin Abdi, and the wider HORUFADHI Media team on our social media platforms that should appear on the screen any moment. Let's get straight into it. We begin with the visit of the Somali President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud to the United Arab Emirates. The visit marks the first visit that the newly elected president takes abroad. The president's team remained quiet throughout the initial few days of the visit, aside from images released by Villa Somalia showcasing the president arriving in Abu Dhabi, which caused quite hysteria on social media. Nevertheless, the president would eventually meet his Emirati counterpart Mohammed ibn Ziyad on June 22nd, according to images and information circulated by the Somali and Emirati presidencies. Now, what were some of the topics agreed upon that were presented to the media and the public? According to the Somali presidency, the government of Somalia and its Emirati counterpart agreed to improve cooperation on trade and security, with both parties agreeing to set up a joint committee to oversee the development and implementation of the proposals discussed in Abu Dhabi. Additionally, the Emirati government pledged to donate $20 million to the federal government of Somalia to support the humanitarian crisis that continues to ravage the country. Aside from governmental support, the UAE also announced the resumption of the direct flights between Mogadishu and the UAE, which was previously terminated due to frosty relations under the presidency of Mohammed Abdullahi Farmajo. It is reported that the Emirati company Fly Dubai will resume flights between the two countries. And the positive side to it is that it greatly supports the Somali diaspora in the UAE, which have complained of increased difficulties in trade and travel between Somalia and the UAE. The UAE, much like Somalia's neighbouring countries Kenya and Ethiopia, hosts a large Somali diaspora, and the Somali businesses have large amounts of headquarters in Abu Dhabi. President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud met with the diaspora during his visits to the country. Lastly, the Emirati government announced the reopening of Sheikh Zayed Hospital in the Somali capital Mogadishu after the UAE closed the hospital in response to the Somali government's decision to cut relations. The hospital was previously free of charge for Somalis. However, aside from all these agreements that politicians tend to shove down our throats, what does this agreement actually translate to for Somalia in terms of politics? Well, firstly, the trip signals that Mohamud's administration sees the UAE as its key partner in the region, as other regional countries have also invited the newly elected president, including Turkey, a key ally of Somalia, particularly in the security sector. This trip also demonstrates a dramatic shift in Somalia's foreign policy initially developed and implemented during the presidency of Mohammed Abdullahi Farmajo, which cut ties with the UAE back in 2018 before relations were restored by the outgoing Prime Minister Mohammed Hussein Roble in 2022. The Farmajo administration cut ties with the UAE for the following reasons. Number one, the delivery of $9.6 million in cash via private plane, which landed in Mogadishu's Aden Ade airport without consultation with the then federal government of Somalia. Additionally, the then President Farmajo also raised concerns about the UAE-trained Somali soldiers that could be taking orders from Abu Dhabi after such events already unfolded in countries like Yemen and Libya. For example, the UAE directly controls 90,000 Yemeni forces that it directly pays salaries as well as provides weapons and training. Groups including Shabwani and Hadrawi elite forces. UAE also controls the SBF in southern Yemen and Abu al-Abbas fighters in southwest of the country. Nevertheless, the Farmajo administration had close relations with the UAE's rival in the Middle East, Qatar. So the question becomes, why is Somalia being dragged into a regional political rivalry that doesn't concern it? The reality is that Somalia is one of the most strategic countries in the world. It sits on the doorsteps of the Suez Canal and the Gulf of Aden, as well as the Red Sea that connects the Persian Gulf with Europe and beyond. It is estimated that around $315 billion passes through Somali waters annually. Aside from its economic relevance, Somalia is also strategically placed south of the Middle East, only a stone throw away from Yemen, a key area in which the current new Arab Cold War is taking place in the form of a proxy war. Additionally, historically Somalia has been a key member of the Arab League. Therefore, by combining all the aforementioned factors, Somalia has unfortunately become a victim of this new Arab Cold War. Why do you ask? Well, Somalia itself has warring political factions that seem to be backed by opposing rivals in the Arab world. It seems as though supporters of Hassan Sheikh Attal tend to lean towards the UAE, whereas supporters of Farmajo Attal tend to lean towards Qatar. Whether this is intentional or not, the reality is that Somalia is being used as a political battleground between these warring foreign factions. The losers of this conflict are unfortunately the Somali people. Somalia must put its interests first, and President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud is absolutely correct to attempt to form friendly relations with all regional countries to have less enemies. However, Somalia must also have limits and respect its own sovereignty to not be used as a pawn for a conflict which has no concern. Now we move on to the second topic of the program today, a rumor circulating all over Somali's media establishment and public of possible talks held between the Somali federal government led by Hassan Sheikh and the Israeli government. However, is this possible? Some argue yes, for two reasons. Number one, it was revealed by the Times of Israel that the then Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, met with the Somali President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud in a first high-level contact between Israel and Somalia in 2016. The newspaper cited a source close to the president at the time. The Times of Israel also revealed a lower-level meeting between Somali and Israeli officials in Jerusalem in 2015. The second reason is the UAE itself is a signatory of the Abraham Accords. Now, for those that do not know, the Abraham Accords are a joint statement between Israel, the United Arab Emirates and the United States, signed on the 30th of August 2020 to normalize relations between the states, which was considered a major shift from historic Arab policy towards Israel. By the end of 2020, the Abraham Accords would expand to include Bahrain, Morocco and the Sudan, albeit the Sudanese Prime Minister Hamdok publicly stated that he didn't want to normalize relations with Israel in return for the US government removing Sudan off the terrorist sanctions list. However, he did so at the end, and Sudan ended up being removed from the terrorist sanctions list. By the end of 2021, the UAE would facilitate a new tripartite agreement between Jordan, Israel and the UAE known as the Electricity for Water Program under the same accord. Talks began in secret in September 2021. And we have to remember that Jordan has been an historical enemy of Israel, fighting in both Israel-Arab wars in 1948 and in 1967, if I'm correct. Now moving on, Oman would also pledge to reconsider its relations with Israel following the US elections. In February 2021, the Omani Foreign Minister stated that Oman was content so far with its relations with Israel in terms of relations and dialogue. Therefore, the possibility that the UAE is attempting to facilitate talks between Somalia and Israel is not far-fetched, as Somalia will just be another Arab League member that could recognize Israel. Its strategic location means that it would be valuable for both Israel and the UAE to establish this agreement. Additionally, the recent revelations by the Wall Street Journal also showcased the extent of deepening Israeli-Arab relations. According to the revelations, top military officials from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, Bahrain, Jordan, and Egypt met with the Chief of Staff of the Israeli Defense Force in Egypt in March of this year. These secret talks were also brokered by the United States. So to summarize, is it possible for Israeli-Somali relations to develop? Absolutely. We've seen UAE facilitate relations for Israel, including with Jordan, an old enemy of Israel. The UAE can do the same for Somalia. The US continues to pressure Arab League states. For example, Sudan was given an ultimatum to sign the Abraham Accords in exchange for its removal from the US terrorist sanctions list. The US can equally twist Somalia's arm. However, in response to the questions posed by the media, Villa Somalia spokesperson Abdulkarim Kar stated that any relation or talks with Israel requires the consultation of the entire Somali government and people. He reiterated that his government would and could not take a decision of such magnitude single-handedly without consultation and an announcement to the Somali people. Now, that is all on the program this week. Before closing, I and the wider HORUFADHI media team would like to take this opportunity to wish the president a strong recovery and good health as he recovers from the COVID-19 virus he recently contracted on his travels to the UAE. A recent Villa Somalia press conference statements indicate a positive recovery, and we hope he continues in that trajectory.